You know, when you walk into a beautifully designed, massive cathedral, or even just like a sleek, modern megachurch today, there's this certain feeling you get.
Oh, definitely. It feels stable, culturally relevant.
Right. The architecture, the polished presentation, the wealthy patrons in the seats, you look around and naturally think, this is success. This institution has made it.
Yeah, I mean, we are practically hardwired to equate size and wealth and just general societal approval with divine blessing.
We really are. But what if someone looked at that exact same building, that exact same influential congregation, and said, this isn't a success story. This is actually a fallen empire. This is spiritual adultery.
Which is a heavy thing to hear.
It is. And that tension is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a stack of sources that, frankly, pull absolutely no punches.
They really don't.
We're exploring excerpts from a historical religious text titled The Great Controversy, specifically chapter 15, which is called The Second Angel's Message. And we've also got a supplementary text containing various biblical verses focused entirely on the mandate to search the scriptures for yourself.
Right, and it is an intensely uncompromising text. So the core mission of our deep dive today is to impartially unpack its arguments. We're looking at this massive clash between pure faith and worldly popularity, and specifically how this text reinterprets the biblical symbol of Babylon.
Exactly. So, okay, let's unpack this, because the author of this source material is entirely unapologetic about calling out systemic institutional corruption.
Yeah, they dive right in.
The foundational premise here starts with a divine wake-up call, like a merciful warning designed to arouse churches from a state of worldliness and backsliding.
What's fascinating here is how the framework sets up that timeless tension, between divine expectations and just human nature's desire for earthly comfort.
Right.
The argument is that people didn't just accidentally drift away from their spiritual core. They were blinded by what the text calls the god of this world.
Meaning they actively preferred earthly treasures over divine light.
Exactly. And the source draws this really vivid parallel to Noah's flood.
Oh, yeah, the flood.
Yeah, back then, everyone was given the opportunity to escape. They were urged to find refuge, but the multitudes completely ignored the warning because they were too busy.
Right, they had other things going on.
Exactly. One turned to his farm, another to his merchandise. They chose the immediate, tangible comforts of their daily economic lives over a spiritual warning.
So it's kind of like hitting the snooze button on a blaring fire alarm just because your bed is incredibly comfortable.
That is a great way to put it.
You hear the alarm, but you convince yourself it's probably just a drill, so you roll over and go back to sleep. But the text claims that hitting that snooze button has a massive downstream consequence.
It does.
It says that when you repeatedly despise these warnings, God's Spirit eventually ceases to arouse conviction. I mean, that implies there is an absolute point of no return for these institutions.
Right, and this raises an important question about the balance between divine mercy and divine judgment. The logic presented is that knowledge and light are given to be cherished and obeyed.
Cherished, yeah.
So if an institution willfully ignores the truth just to protect its comfort, the alarm doesn't just get quieter, the institution literally goes deaf to it. The light they rejected actually becomes darkness to them. At that stage, all preaching, all hearing is entirely in vain.
So the very mechanism meant to save them ends up blinding them further, and that's because of their own willful rejection, which completely changes the nature of the institution.
It does.
Once a church goes deaf to that initial warning, it falls into a state of deep confusion. And this is where the text brings in the biblical symbol of Babylon, which literally translates to confusion.
Right, the language of Revelation.
Yeah, and if you follow this topic, you already know the standard historical symbolism. A virtuous woman represents a pure church, and Babylon, the harlot of Revelation 17, represents a corrupt, apostate church. And historically, many reformers pointed straight at Rome.
Oh yeah, that was the standard Protestant line for centuries. Rome was Babylon.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This text introduces a massive theological plot twist. It argues that the fall of Babylon announced in this specific second warning cannot just refer to the Catholic Church.
Right, because Rome, according to the author, had already been in a fallen condition for centuries.
Exactly. The text claims this specific warning applies directly to the Protestant churches.
Which is a stunning pivot. I mean, the Protestant reformers believed they had broken away from the corruption of the Mother Church.
Right, they thought they were the pure ones now.
Exactly. But this argument portrays them as the daughters who have inherited the exact same corrupt DNA, and they're following the exact same worldly example.
Calling these incredibly diverse Protestant sects the fallen daughters of Babylon is a massive accusation. And I have to push back a little on the reasoning here.
Sure.
The text labels them as Babylon, as a symbol of total confusion, essentially because they have different creeds, but they profess to use the Bible. Isn't it a bit harsh to call them an apostate empire just because they have different theological preferences?
Well, in this framework, it goes much deeper than just having slightly different preferences.
Mm-hmm.
The argument leans heavily on the fact that Christ prayed for complete unity among his followers.
Mm.
One Lord, one faith, one baptism.
Okay, yeah.
But instead, what we observe in the Protestant landscape is an almost innumerable fracturing, just conflicting sects and theories everywhere.
Right, thousands of denominations.
Exactly. And this discordant religious noise is framed not as a healthy diversity of thought, but as the active work of Satan.
Because it creates a smokescreen.
Precisely. It leaves the secular world looking at Christianity and having absolutely no idea what to believe is truth. The confusion itself is the evidence of the fall.
And, that fracturing doesn't just happen in a vacuum. The text doesn't blame this fall on a simple misunderstanding of Scripture. It points the finger straight at their bank accounts and their social calendars.
Yeah, it really goes after their societal ties.
Right. The specific worldly behavior that causes this fall is an alliance with secular society.
And the metaphor used is deeply personal. The church's relationship with Christ is framed as a solemn marriage covenant.
Like a wedding vow.
Yes. So when the church turns its affection away from God to seek after vanity and just the love of worldly things, it commits spiritual adultery. The text cites the Apostle James, who bluntly calls those who assimilate to the world adulterers and adulteresses.
Wow, that is blunt. And the source gets incredibly specific about how this plays out in real life. A profession of religion basically becomes like a trendy, popular networking tool.
Right.
You have rulers, politicians, lawyers, and merchants joining the church, not out of deep conviction, but to secure the respect of society. They want to advance their own worldly interests. They use a profession of Christianity to cover unrighteous transactions.
It's just a cover for them.
Exactly. And the churches, suddenly flush with the wealth of these baptized worldlings, start making a bid for even more popularity.
Which absolutely manifests in the physical environment. They build these extravagantly embellished churches on popular avenues. The congregants wear costly, fashionable attire.
And it impacts the message from the pulpit, too. These churches pay high salaries for talented ministers to entertain rather than preach hard truths.
Right, keep the donors happy.
Yeah, the sermons are smoothed out for fashionable ears, which means fashionable sinners are enrolled on the church records, while fashionable sins are completely concealed under a pretense of godliness.
It's all about appearances.
It really makes me think of a brilliant, raw indie band that suddenly signs to a massive corporate record label.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. At first, they think they've made it. They get the stadium tour and the immense wealth. But then the label executives start giving notes. Hey, can you make this song a little more radio-friendly? Don't be so edgy. We have corporate sponsors to think about.
Yeah, dilute the message.
Exactly. Eventually, the band loses its soul, and they are essentially just singing corporate jingles while wearing designer clothes.
That captures the dynamic perfectly.
Yeah.
The architecture and the wealth are just the visible symptoms of an internal spiritual rot.
So what does this all mean for the everyday churchgoer? Is the source suggesting that any form of popularity or beautiful architecture is inherently a sign of apostasy?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the core issue isn't aesthetics, it's allegiance. To secure the favor and financial support of the great men of earth, the church breaks its solemn vows of fidelity to the King of Heaven.
So it's the compromise of truth in exchange for patronage.
Exactly.
And there is a massive downstream consequence to courting all those wealthy patrons. Once your institution relies on their funding and social capital, a conflict of interest emerges.
A huge one.
You can't keep preaching hard, uncompromising truths without alienating your new donors. So the theology itself has to change. To keep the patrons happy, the church starts serving up what the text intensely calls the wine of the wrath of her fornication.
That phrase is so striking. This cup of intoxication represents the specific false doctrines adopted through unlawful connection with the secular world. The church absorbed the world's philosophies, corrupted its own faith, and then fed those corrupted doctrines back to the masses.
And the list of doctrines in this cup is highly specific. It mentions the temporal millennium, the promise of 1,000 years of earthly peace and prosperity.
Right.
It calls out universalism, the idea that everyone is saved regardless of their actions. It also points to the natural immortality of the soul, which it claims opened the door to modern spiritualism and errors like purgatory. But why these specific doctrines? How do they function as wine?
They function as a theological sedative. Think about the mechanics of the temporal millennium or universalism. They tell the listener, don't worry, you don't need to panic, you don't need to radically change your life, everything is fine.
They completely neutralize any urgency for spiritual reform. It's
Yes.
like an algorithm feed designed purely for user engagement. The church starts stirring up doctrines not because they are objectively true, but because they have the highest approval rating with the worldly demographic they are trying to capture.
That's spot on. They remove all the friction.
They really do. And the text notes that the most dangerous assumptions of all are the beliefs that the law of God was abolished at the cross and that the Sabbath of the fourth commandment was replaced by Sunday worship.
Right, and that specific grievance about the Sabbath versus Sunday is critical to the text argument. In this framework, shifting the day of worship represents the ultimate surrender of divine law to human tradition.
Oh, I see.
It's the institution saying, we prefer the tradition established by popular society over the explicit commandment of God.
But I want to pause and look at this from the perspective of a normal person sitting in the pews. The text says that when faithful teachers actually try to expound the true word of God, men of learning and highly educated ministers denounce that sound doctrine as heresy.
Yeah, they actively attack it.
So if the recognized experts are the ones pouring this intoxicating wine, how in the world is a regular listener supposed to know who is actually right?
That tragic reality is exactly why the text makes such a bold claim. It says, the sin of the world's impenitence lies at the door of the church. The world is hopelessly intoxicated by this Babylonish wine.
That's heavy.
It is. The argument is that if the church had simply maintained its integrity and preached the plain, cutting truths of the Bible, multitudes would have been convicted and converted. But because the trusted leaders are compromised, the regular listener is led entirely astray, feeling comfortably numb while being spiritually poisoned.
Which brings us to a breaking point. If the popular institutional churches are heavily invested in this algorithm of engagement and flat out refuse to change, what happens to the individuals on the inside who realize the theology is skewed?
Right, the ones who wake up.
Yeah. The text uses the historical example of William Miller to illustrate the agonizing psychology of this separation.
William Miller is the perfect case study here. He had absolutely zero intention of causing divisions or forming a separate denomination.
Right, none at all.
His stated goal was simple: notify the world of the coming judgment, convert souls, and tell those converts to go right back to their existing churches to revise them.
He honestly thought all Christians would rejoice at the prospect of Christ's return.
He really did.
Instead, the established churches actively suppressed the subject. Believers who accepted the message were ridiculed, oppressed, and denied the privilege of speaking about their hope.
It placed these believers in a position of agonizing trial. I mean, they loved their churches. They were loath to separate from their communities and their social circles.
It's the classic story of a corporate whistleblower.
Oh, absolutely.
You have someone inside a company who uncovers a massive flaw. They love the company, they don't want to destroy it, they just want to fix the problem. So they take it to middle management. But management doesn't want the bad PR or the hit to their donor base.
So they gag the whistleblower.
Exactly. They isolate them, mock them, and eventually the whistleblower is forced to quit and start a rival firm just to get the truth out. The text says these believers finally felt justified and forced to cast off the yoke, declaring Babylon is fallen and physically separating from their former congregations.
The institution gave them no choice. And the text quotes the prophet Ezekiel talking about men setting up idols in their heart, and the Apostle Paul describing a people having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof.
Meaning they look the part, but the substance is gone.
Right. The institution retains the beautiful external shell of religion, but the internal engine of truth is completely gone.
So in this framework, reform from within is structurally impossible. The whistleblower can never fix the corporation once it reaches this state of decay.
The text takes a definitive stance on that.
Mm.
To back it up, it quotes the Protestant reformer Melanchthon. He said, "There is no other church than the assembly of those who have the word of God and who are purified by it."
That's a powerful quote.
It is. The true church isn't a building, a historical lineage or a brand name. It's the body of truth seekers. Once an institution willfully spurns the truth, the Spirit of the Lord is withdrawn, and true believers can no longer regard that institution as the Church of Christ.
That is a heavy, heavy line to draw. And it leads directly into the climax of the source material and those supplementary verses we mentioned at the start. Because if institutional reform is impossible, the only thing left is a dramatic ultimatum for the individual believer.
Well, the text acknowledges a vital caveat first. It states that many true Christians are still trapped inside Babylon.
Oh, right.
They are in these fallen communions, but they aren't comfortable. They are dissatisfied, longing for clearer light, and looking in vain for the image of Christ in their current surroundings.
And as those institutional churches ally themselves closer to the secular world, God issues a final command. Come out of her, my people.
And how do you navigate that exit? That's where the chapter supplement provides the mechanism. It is a curated list of biblical verses hammering home one single point rigorous personal study of the Bible.
It's all about doing the reading yourself.
Exactly. It quotes Jesus in John 5:39 saying, "Search the Scriptures." It praises the believers in Acts 17:11 who search the Scriptures daily, whether those things were so.
It is the ultimate DIY spiritual mandate. You cannot outsource your beliefs to a high-paid minister with a smooth sermon. You cannot trust the stained glass or the wealthy congregation. You have to do the reading yourself.
You really do.
But there is a massive tension here. The text promises that those who search will find knowledge, but it also explicitly warns that the spirit of persecution will again be revealed. So how does the source reconcile the inner peace of finding the truth with the severe external conflict of having to abandon your entire community?
It synthesizes those two realities by fundamentally redefining what peace actually is. It draws a sharp contrast.
Okay, how so?
Well, on one hand, it quotes 2 Thessalonians, saying those who prefer unrighteousness will be left to receive a strong delusion. They enjoy external societal peace, but it is built on a complete fabrication.
Ah, I see.
On the other hand, the light of truth shines on open hearts. Looking back to the very first paragraph of our source material, it argues that real peace of heart only comes from dedicating our lives fully to God and forsaking worldliness entirely.
So the external persecution is almost like the collateral damage of being on the right path.
Precisely. The separation will bring earthly conflict, loss of reputation, and severe social friction. But it yields true internal spiritual peace, which the source argues is the only peace that can withstand the final judgment.
Let's recap this journey for you listening, because we've covered some intense ground today.
We really have.
We started with the sheer danger of hitting the spiritual snooze button, how ignoring a wake-up call eventually leaves an institution entirely deaf to the truth. We explored the intoxicating pull of worldly popularity, how the desire for social capital causes a church to alter its theology, like an algorithm chasing engagement, and how that leads to spiritual adultery.
Which leads to the wine of false doctrine.
Right. And finally, we looked at the heavy individual responsibility to search the source material for yourself, even if it means painfully separating from your community. The core takeaway here is that, according to this text, you simply cannot have both the approval of the secular world and the approval of heaven.
It presents a stark, binary choice in a modern world that deeply prefers gray areas.
It really does. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've just discussed. The text emphasizes that true believers must eventually separate from these corrupt, popular institutions.
Right, to come out of Babylon.
Exactly. We saw that agonizing process with William Miller. But here's the question. In doing so, how do these newly separated groups prevent themselves from eventually becoming the very thing they fled?
Wow.
Is the cycle of institutionalization, rising popularity, and eventual theological compromise just an inevitable human loop? Does staying true to the original message require a constant, endless series of painful separations?
That might be the most challenging question of human organizational history.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep digging into your own sources, keep questioning the institutions around you, and keep searching for the truth. Until next time.